Welcome, everyone, to the July installment of the Celebrating Malheur Speaker Series. I am Janelle Wicks, and I'm the Executive Director for the Friends of Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. This program, which has taken place every month, starting in January, is part of our celebration of the Friends of Malheur turning 25 years old this year. So if you've missed any of the programs, please feel free to jump onto our YouTube channel and check out the recordings. So, Malheur National Wildlife Refuge is why our organization exists. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that the refuge is 187,000 acres of diverse habitat in the Great Basin, which exists on the territorial homelands of the Wadataka Band of Northern Paiute. So want to acknowledge that at the front and also mention that while I am hosting a program from our brand new office in downtown Burns, adjacent to the Harney County Chamber's office, I do have an assistant with me this afternoon. So I will probably be muted most of the program until we hit the question and answer towards the end. So be sure that you have found your chat box and you know that you can drop your questions in there. So the Friends of Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, our mission is to promote the conservation and appreciation of the refuge's cultural and natural resources. We do that in what we identify as 3 different sort of camps. And what I always say is that when we're doing our jobs right, all of these things are intersectional. So outreach and education, advocacy, and conservation stewardship are the venues for which we promote the refuge and are really seeking engagement from the public and the community to be stewards for Malheur Refuge. Our organization is member and donor supported. We currently have over 1,200 annual dues paying members that are supporting our organization and as a part of this community that supports and is passionate about Malheur National Wildlife Refuge and all the wildlife that depend on it. That includes in part, but in addition to, over 1,400 donors that will contribute monthly or maybe during our end of year fundraising campaign or maybe towards a special project that they feel really passionately about. So really, we don't exist as an organization in support of the refuge without the people that do it in community with us. So we are all the Friends of Malheur Refuge. We do have these happening monthly, and I'll talk again at the end of the program about what we have coming up. But just a reminder to stick around once the question and answer has concluded, as we'll have some wrap-up notes. Okay. And with that, I want to introduce tonight's presenter, Teresa Bird Wicks of Bird Alliance of Oregon. They are the Eastern Oregon Program Manager biologist and have been working out here since 2018. And so without further ado, Bird.
Okay, I hope everybody can see that and there are no black boxes in the way. Hello, I'm Bird. I work for Bird Alliance of Oregon as their Eastern Oregon biologist and program lead, and have been in Harney County, as Janelle said, for over 6 years now. And my work out here encompasses 3 prongs, if you will. One of them is biological work, mostly monitoring on refuge and off refuge as part of our work with Harney Basin Wetlands Collaborative. I also do a lot of outreach and policy work, but policy as in attending collaborative meetings and working with partners to, like with our community-based water planning effort, to help create suggested guidelines and guideline changes to Oregon Water Resources Department and for water management and things like that. So it's policy, but less in a legislative sense and more in a how are we doing work on the ground, and how is land management potentially being affected by some of that work. So my talk today, land, water, and air, working at the intersection between migratory flyways, land management, and bird conservation. Essentially, I'm going to focus on not Avatar, which I read this title to a friend and they thought I was going to be talking about The Last Airbender, which if you have kids and you've watched a cartoon, you know what I mean, and if not, that's okay. So a lot of the work that we do focuses on birds, but birds are pretty specifically influenced by what's happening on the ground in terms of land management and water. So we're going to kind of talk about how all of that intersects in the work we do out here. And so a little bit of background about Bird Alliance of Oregon. So in the early 1900s, Finley and Bowman came out to to what is now Harney County and Malheur National Wildlife Refuge to take photographs and explore the area, in part because of all of the reports of these really large nesting colonies of great egrets and snowy egrets. When they came in the early 1900s, they found a handful of egrets at best. Most of them were chicks that were dying because their parents had been killed for their plumes for the plume trade. So in 1908, they petitioned for designation of Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. Finley, it was actually the first president, if you will, of the Bird Alliance of Oregon. At the time, we were called Oregon Audubon Society. And he also, through his work with Oregon Audubon Society at the time, was part of getting Lower Klamath National Wildlife Refuge and Three Arches National Wildlife Refuge on the coast started. So, you know, our organization has been working across the state from the coast to the Sagebrush Sea since the early 1900s. In 2008, the refuge began their comprehensive conservation plan process, and it was a collaborative process that brought in partners to help guide the drafting of priorities and all of the components of a CCP. And part of what came out of this collaborative process was a collaborative approach to inventory and monitoring at Malheur. So 2012, we began supporting the inventory and monitoring program through helping to draft protocols, prioritizing species for monitoring, and then actually having seasonal staff on the ground conducting a lot of those surveys. And then in 2018, we hired our first full-time staffer on the ground. That's me. So I live and work out here full-time year-round. And so we've been out here engaging year-round just for the last 6.5 years. So a little bit about where we are located. I imagine if you're tuning into this, you probably know where we're located, but just as a primer, so we are in the Pacific Flyway. Flyways are divided largely by mountain ranges. So this is essentially the Rocky Mountains. So from the coast to the Rocky Mountains-ish is the Pacific Flyway. Within the Pacific Flyway, there is a region that we call the Intermountain West, and that is essentially the landmass between the Cascade Mountains, Sierra Nevada Mountains, Rocky Mountains. So all of that, rain shadow influenced, dryish, high desertish region is all part of the Intermountain West. Within the Intermountain West, we have what we affectionately call the Sonic. So that's the Southern Oregon, Northeast California, part of Nevada region. And essentially the Sonic, like one of the things that is the coolest, in my opinion, about it is that it is a region that, despite being very dry, also has considerable wetland habitat. So that's wetlands from temporary or seasonal wetlands to semi-permanent wetlands to really large lakes like Upper Klamath and Malheur Lake were historically, Tule Lake, all of those really big lakes that used to exist, it's kind of remarkable that they all exist in this pretty dry region. So the sonic is really important. Historically, the breaking out of the sonic from the rest of the Intermountain West was kind of spurred by concerns about waterfowl population declines. A lot of the habitat within this sonic region is really important for migratory waterfowl, but once that work started, looking at how important these, wet areas in a kind of dry landscape are for waterfowl, we realized they're also really important for a tremendous number of passerines, songbirds, shorebirds, marsh nesting birds, et cetera. And so the sonic really is very important for a lot of bird species, not just waterfowl. And then very specifically, this is the Harney Basin here, where it says Hines/Burns. So land and water. One of the things that we talk about a lot in collaborative work out here is that nexus of land management, land ownership, et cetera, and water management. So that public-private difference in how land is managed, a lot of conversations about water appropriations and how water is distributed, the timing of water arrival, et cetera. So I have these questions as kind of a fun game, if you will, for people. If you want to just put your answers in the chat, I will mostly just end up giving you the answers because we don't have a better way to do that right now. But so my first question for you is, what percentage of wetlands have been lost in the Intermountain West? Oh, some good guesses coming in. So about 60%, and that's an average across the Intermountain West. There are some regions where a larger extent of wetlands have been lost, and there are some areas where slightly less have been lost, but 60% is the average acreage of wetlands lost across the Intermountain West. And then the next question is, what percentage of wetlands occur on private land? So that's within the Intermountain West. What percentage of wetlands occur on private land? Oh, I like that Lynn gave such a specific percentage. All right, give you a couple more seconds to think about it. Oh, Peter also with a specific percentage. I love that. So it's about 70%. About 70% of wetlands across the Intermountain West occur on private land. And that is largely associated with flood irrigation. So very specifically, within the sonic, there's a lot of work being done to maintain historic flood irrigation, which mimics that seasonal or temporal wetland, especially for migratory birds. And so a lot of the work that is done, mostly through partnerships across the sonic and specifically in the Harney Basin, is done to maintain flood irrigation instead of it converting to sprinkler irrigation. So a lot of that flood irrigation is what's creating a lot of that wetland on private lands. And then the last question is, what percentage of semi-permanent wetlands are on public lands? So semi-permanent are wetlands that are inundated year-round most years. So your wetlands that have bulrush in them, cattail in them, especially if it's more than just a thin band along the perimeter. So we're really talking about that good nesting habitat for a lot of our marsh birds, Franklin's gulls, white-faced ibis, et cetera. So what percentage of those excellent breeding habitat wetlands are on public lands? Oh, Peter, you're real close. So it's about 70%. So while 70% of wetlands across the region occur on private land, only about 30% of the semi-permanent wetlands that we have are so that only about 30% of the wetlands that are semi-permanent are on private land. So that breeding habitat that we're able to maintain, persisting largely from year to year, is mostly on public lands like Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. All right, so then air. And I broke this into migratory and breeding for two reasons. One is that migratory birds need very different or largely different conditions than breeding birds do. Our migratory birds, they benefit from short stubble habitat because the theory is that when the grass is mowed short, the sun, like the radiation from the sun can warm the soil in places where the grass is mowed short faster, so that high protein spring new growth of grass occurs earlier in the year in fields that are mowed versus fields that are unmowed. A lot of that has to do with the fact that most of our meadows out here are not native grass meadows. So I don't know what would happen if we, somehow were able to convert a bunch of meadows to all native grasses, which are often a little bit shorter or bunchier, et cetera. And then also the migratory birds, when they flood irrigate the meadows, that also brings up to the surface where it's easier to access, like seeds and insects and things like that so the birds can go in and access those like high nutrient content seeds and invertebrates and whatnot a little bit easier earlier in the spring, which again really benefits migratory birds. For breeding birds, most of them there are very few birds that nest actually in water, and very few birds that nest in short stubble habitat or grass that is tall. And by tall, I mean like waist height or higher. And so they really need that mix of conditions. They need something that is heterogeneous across the landscape rather than a homogeneous habitat type, which is in the spring, if you've been out here early enough, sometimes the landscape looks pretty homogeneous in those meadows. Once the growing season starts, around the time birds are starting to initiate nesting, those meadows look pretty different. All right, so the questions for our air. The first one is, what percentage of summer greater sandhill crane habitat is associated with agricultural lands? That's a really long way of essentially saying what percentage of the area sandhill cranes hang out in the summer is made up by agricultural lands. So the average is about 80%, and it varies a little bit across the Intermountain West, but the thing to know about this is that this study looked at sandhill cranes that they had satellite transmitters placed on their backs, and so they're transmitting data for where they're hanging out. And so we don't know if they attempted to nest. We don't know if they did attempt to nest, if they were successful. So this doesn't give us a lot of information about nesting conditions, and it doesn't give us a lot of information about nest success, but it does tell us that probably the fact that such a large percentage of wetlands in the spring are on private land is part of why greater sandhill cranes, such a large percentage of their territories in the summer are made up by agricultural lands, because a lot of that wetland habitat is on private land. But again, we don't necessarily know what that means for nest success and reproductive outcomes. All right, so the second question, what meadow type is most important for nesting birds? By meadow type, I mean dry meadow, like dampish meadow, or wet meadow as in flooded pretty deep. Yeah, so I've seen quite a few people say that like intermediate level, and that's correct. So damp, or what we would call mesic meadows, where the grass isn't like, it's not necessarily promoting growth of emergent vegetation, like the really wet meadows do, but it's also growing lots of forbs and things that dry meadows often don't. So that in-between meadow is what we believe is actually the best habitat for nesting birds. And then my last question, and mostly this is just a fun one, true or false, all duck species nest in wetlands? Yeah, all the answers in the chat are correct. False. We have lots of ducks that nest, are cavity nesters, so they nest, in hollow trees or nest boxes. And then a lot of our ducks, actually all of our ducks out here, are either a nest adjacent to wetlands. So like mallards pretty commonly will nest on the upper edges of ponds. Cinnamon teal are known to nest up in shrubs sometimes, and so they kind of vary from that really close to the water to kind of dry and shrubby in terms of what they're looking for when they're initiating nesting. So the mosaics that we have out here in Harney County, where you've got wetlands and ponds that are adjacent to, sagebrush and bitterbrush and whatnot, actually are great nesting habitat for a lot of these species that want to nest up in the uplands. All right, so a little bit more about the work that we're doing out here that I'm most excited about. So passive monitoring is part of active partnership. So when I first moved here, all of the monitoring, or I would say like 90% of the monitoring happening at Malheur National Wildlife Refuge around bird populations was happening in the southern unit. So we call Unit 12, that's the area from Knox Pondish down to P Ranch, and then east to west, the expanse of the refuge. And, we, especially with drought and some of these conversations around invasive grasses, we started identifying a need to be able to expand the monitoring we were doing, but it is not necessarily feasible to hire enough people. I mean, Malheur National Wildlife Refuge is over 187,000 acres. It's not feasible to monitor that entire acreage with, boots on the ground type monitoring. And so in a previous life, I had done an acoustic monitoring project using what are often called autonomous recording units. They're also called passive acoustic monitors, or PAMs. I kind of like that PAMs acronym better because I think it seems more fun and it gives them a little bit of personality. So 2021, we piloted using acoustic monitors to monitor birds in wet meadows on Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. We received funding to put 6 out on the landscape. And essentially, my goal with that was to, alleviate the concerns that a lot of people had about using a computer, essentially, to monitor birds. Because if you've never used passive acoustic monitoring before, it does seem like something that should be questioned in terms of its efficacy. So essentially, once we were able to demonstrate to partners that they work well, they actually record much farther than we thought they did because it's so open out here, and that it's feasible to get them out on the landscape and leave them out there for the breeding season, et cetera. We were able to partner with the refuge to expand the monitoring. They purchased 10 acoustic devices. And so in 2022 and 2023, we deployed 16 acoustic monitors, mostly within the Buena Vista area. And then in 2023, we started working with partners to find other ways to use this passive monitoring to our benefit. And so by 2024, so this season, we now have, I think it's 57 acoustic monitors across the Harney Basin. So that's from Burns to south of Fields. And the partners on that include Harney Basin Wetlands Collaborative partners like Soil and Water Conservation District, Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, and Oregon Desert Land Trust. And so I'm going to go a little bit into the data processing part, mostly because I am an audio nerd, and I think it's really fun that we have found a way to get reliable data and numbers from these acoustic devices. So we do this in multiple phases. The first phase we call the listening phase. We randomly select 8 recordings from each site, and then trained volunteers and staff listen to those recordings. They tag individuals as they find them. And that data mimics the way we do our, boots on the ground monitoring. And so the data is actually comparable to the rest of the data that we're collecting without the acoustic devices. Phase 2 is our recognizer with validation. That's a really fancy way of saying we're essentially using AI to find and identify their best guess at the birds that are in the recordings. And so the software we use is BirdNet. It's from Cornell Lab of Ornithology. It is the base, like the brain for Merlin Bird ID. So we can put the 800 to 1,000 recordings we typically have at each site into BirdNet, and it will run an analysis on all of those recordings, and then it outputs a table, and we can essentially compare our phase 1 data to the phase 2 data, and then the only thing we have to actually validate are species we didn't find ourselves. So that's essentially rare birds or birds that just aren't vocalizing often, swallows, things like that. And so the 2022 data, we're not quite done with the 2023 data. But all of these blue dots are places where we had our acoustic monitors. And in the first season, we detected 105 species. That's pretty close to the total number of species we have detected over 10 years of doing land bird monitoring with like a person on the ground. So within this one season, we captured or documented almost the same number as 10 years of monitoring on the ground with a person. 25 of those species were detected at least once at 100% of these acoustic recorders. And one of those is the American avocet. And the wild thing about that for me is that we never saw avocet at any of these sites, but we know they were there because we have the acoustic recordings of them. And then 27 additional species we found at more than 50% of the sites, and 53 species were infrequent. And that's species that are associated with less common habitat in these fields. So long-eared owls, because of the riparian area, eared grebes, things like that. So our current list of projects on Turn Island, which is the island out on Malheur Lake that was created by the Army Corps of Engineers, we currently have 3 acoustic devices and 3 game cameras. And 3 acoustic devices seems like a lot, but one of the reasons we ended up with 3 on the island is that there are so many gulls on the island that just having one device on one region of the island, the gulls wash out almost everything else vocalizing. And so our hope is that by kind of triangulating them on the island, we'll actually be able to record species who are vocalizing farther away from where so last year we had just one site, and we're hoping we can get better data for some of the quieter or less vocal species, just because the gulls are so loud. And then 3 game cameras are essentially for a similar reason. Birds tend to divide themselves a bit on Turn Island, and so we have the game cameras distributed in a way where we'll be able to get better views of the different groups of birds on their nests, and also hopefully see through the gulls a little better than we did last year. And then at Oregon Desert Land Trust, their Trout Creek Ranch site, which is south of Fields, we have 10 acoustic devices distributed across 3 of their different habitat types, essentially. Most of them are in meadows, but we are also monitoring a spring on their property. And then our land bird surveys, so that's the project we started in 2022. We now have 32 acoustic devices distributed across Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. largely associated with a diversity of riparian habitat and wet meadow habitat, and kind of that intersection between them. And then the thing I'm going to focus on a little bit more, hopefully very quickly, is our reed canary grass project. So for this project, we have 12 devices distributed across public and private property in the Sylvia's floodplain and at the south end of the refuge. So our questions with the reed canary grass project, we were trying to figure out if bird communities are different at sites invaded by reed canary grass. Does the level of invasion matter? So do they avoid reed canary grass altogether? Are they only avoiding it if it's a monoculture, et cetera? And then how are birds interacting with the vegetation at each site? So are they avoiding the reed canary grass? Are they foraging in it but not nesting in it? Are they nesting in it but not foraging in it? And then is there some combination of these things happening? And then the really important questions: how are birds likely to be affected by a growing season treatment of reed canary grass? We know that one of the ways to combat the invasion of reed canary grass will require treatments that are happening while the grass before the grass has gone dormant, before it's had the chance to set seeds and build new rhizomes. And so that would require treatments earlier in the year than the meadows are currently being treated. And by treatment, I mean like mowing or disking or things like that. And then how can we better manage wet meadows in a changing climate? So if water matters, how can we manage the water in a way that will best benefit the land and the birds? So a little bit about background on this. It's a partnership with the Harney Basin Wetlands Collaborative, the refuge, and private landowners. And essentially, we just, are trying to figure out how birds are now being affected and be able to create that prediction into the future for how they will be affected by or benefit from treatments. Every site has one acoustic recorder at it to try to get at the really basic data, like what species are there, how many individuals of each species, some of that general community data. We realized that doing traditional point counts or using the acoustic data would not give us information about how the birds are actually interacting with reed canary grass that's at these sites. And so we created a breeding bird index this is my data sheet from one site. And the idea is that we are attempting to not only count how many individuals of each species are at the site, but we are trying to document where at the site they are. These surveys happen weekly in order to try to document breeding behavior, including whether or not any young fledged. And then the idea is that we will be able to overlay this data with our habitat map that we have to be able to answer some of those questions about, like, are there birds that are not going to the reed canary grass at all? Are there birds that we see carrying food into that site where the reed canary grass is, but not foraging there, et cetera? So the idea is that this may help us answer that question. Some of our early findings. So it's a lot of words, but the areas that we identified as mixed reed canary grass, so that's early stages of invasion, typically had more species at them. On the refuge, those are the species that had bobolink, particularly in kind of high numbers. The reed canary grass sites typically had lower numbers, except for the dry intact sites. And so overall, the mixed sites were a little bit higher in terms of like numbers of individuals and species than the intact sites, than the reed canary grass sites, if you were to kind of rank them. So this picture here is a picture of one of our acoustic devices in a reed canary grass field. All of this very tall grass is reed canary grass. And then this device is one that is deployed at a mixed site. It's early in the season, so the grass is still pretty short. By the end of the season, it was a bit taller, but nothing like this reed canary grass site. So the reed canary grass sites and the intact sites, like I said, averaged lower number of species than the mixed sites. And to me, the thing that became the most obvious is that the combination, oh no, that's the next slide, sorry. Water depth also seemed to influence whether or not birds were, or the number of species at a site. So sites that were dry, despite what the habitat was, typically had lower number of species, as did the sites that were very wet. So that's the places that had water deep enough that you were going to flood, your boots, or have to wear waders to go into because the water was deep. It was those intermediate sites, just like the intermediate level of invasion of reed canary grass, that appeared to have more species. And it's really the part that was most interesting to me is that combination. So we had one reed canary grass site that normally has water, that this year the timing of the water delayed when water arrived there. So we were doing surveys in that field when there was no water. So that combination of no water and reed canary grass was a really interesting thing to see. The dry intact site, so it's a site that has largely native grasses, or what we would call intact / native-ish meadow, but no water at it, also appeared to have very few species. That mesic mix, so that's like the intermediate, and the dry mix appeared to have higher levels of species, as did those sites that were mesic, so just had less than 3 inches of water and were considered intact meadows. And so these sites here, this site is our dry intact site, our dry mix site. So this dry mix that had 18 species at it, a lot of those species, you can kind of tell from this picture, were associated with upland habitat or willows. So this is a site that's going to be a little bit weird for analyzing the data, because a lot of the species within our count circle are actually not necessarily there because there's meadow habitat, but they're there because there's rocks and willows and things that they find attractive for nesting in. And then again, this was our wet reed canary grass site. The water here was almost knee deep up until the time they started drying the field out. And then this site is our, this is the dry intact site. So the grass didn't get much taller than what you see in this picture. So not, oh no, I'm sorry. The grass didn't get taller than this, but this is one of our mesic intact sites. So this is a site that still has largely the forbs and rushes and things we want to see in a meadow, and had 3 inches or less of water. So you can see they're all pretty different, which will make processing the data challenging, but fun. So what does this all mean? We don't know yet. 1 year of data, this is the second wet year in a row. If we had started this study 2 years ago, in 2022, back when the drought was so bad, maybe we would see something different. We don't really know. So we're going to continue doing this monitoring for at least another year or two before we start doing experimental treatments on private property, so that we can better understand, have a better baseline for what bird communities look like in these different habitat types, and create a solid plan for how we're going to treat this reed canary grass, because it does appear to affect birds that are, what birds are going to use those meadows that are invaded. And then we'll be putting all of this bird data together with the land, which is mostly vegetation data, the water, so how deep and how long was it inundated, and air, which is our bird community, and then also air adjacent is our macroinvertebrate community. So we are also doing some macroinvertebrate surveying to understand what food is available across these sites, to see if food potentially is also influencing where birds are, where they're nesting, etc. Our hypothesis is that areas that are rich in forbs will be richer in invertebrates for birds to eat and to feed to their chicks, but we'll see. And this right here is a mallard nest that is in some false lupin out in one of the sites. And I thought it was very lovely. It's very pretty what a view she had all season. All right, so now we have time for questions, I think.
Yes, we do. So please put your questions in the chat box. love to entertain some questions from you all. It was a lot of really great information. So please feel free to share your curiosities. No questions for me. I will share, full disclosure, so those of you that don't know, Bird is my spouse, and so I get to hear about this stuff all the time and see the pictures that are coming out of the field and all the cool stuff that Bird gets to see and observe. So Peter says, how do you think doing the study in a dry year would have changed your results?
It's a really good question. And so in a dry year, and this is based on specifically doing surveys at Malheur, so it's harder to say, you know, what's going to be happening, or if the exact same thing we saw in the meadows at Malheur is the same as like in the Sylvia's floodplain. But a lot of those meadows, the grasses stay shorter, the forbs typically grow different, they're shorter, sometimes less abundant. And so it is possible that, well, first, that some of the sites that are in it that have like pretty large monocultures of reed canary grass would have been similar to the dry reed canary grass field, which is kind of an anomaly and super weird. And I was pretty intrigued by it. I think it's also possible that some of the sites that maybe the vegetation structure wasn't as ideal. So I think of that as being our reed canary grass sites. But they had water at them. Potentially we would have seen more birds attempting to use those sites. We did have a lot of marsh birds, like those reed canary grass sites that were inundated, you know, up to about a foot deep. The coots were everywhere in them, and sora. And so I think it's possible we just would have seen some of that distribution a little bit different. Red-winged blackbirds were pretty ubiquitous across all of the sites, which was pretty interesting. So I don't know, like in a dry year, would we have seen more red-winged blackbirds using reed canary grass than we did this year? Maybe. It's kind of hard to say. Bobolink. So one of the interesting things about bobolink is that they will often nest, and similar to phalarope, they're nesting where the ground isn't necessarily completely dry, but it's maybe a little bit damp, and they can build a nest above where that damp is, and are often not like right adjacent to the water, but are not in the really dry meadows either. And so it's this really interesting thing where in a drought, we see the bobolink distributed pretty different. And so in a drought year, I would probably have anticipated that some of these sites that are mesic would have actually had higher numbers of some of those species like phalarope and bobolink at them, just because the habitat was limited. It doesn't mean it's better. It just means that it was so limited across the landscape. Like 2022, it's pretty hard to find a lot of that. And so I think we just would have seen the birds distributed across a lot of those sites different than we did this year, because all of the sites except for the one dry intact meadow had at least some water. And so I think, yeah, I think we would have seen the distribution maybe be a bit different than it was this year, but I don't know.
Okay, we have a few more questions here. So I'm gonna combine a couple of them that make sense. So Peter just follows up to say, definitely hard to do monitoring with how variable things are here.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, so Melissa asks, and I'm going to add a couple of things to this. So Melissa asks, are you basically looking for a way to get rid of the reed canary grass? There was another question that indicated, like, where did the canary grass come from? And then, you know, we talk a lot about reed canary grass here, where cheatgrass is a problem in other places. And someone asked if cheatgrass is a problem here as well.
So I'm going to try to answer those in a different order than you asked them and try to catch all the questions. But so cheatgrass, we do have some cheatgrass on the refuge. It's only largely in the like sagebrush, greasewood, so that shrubby shrubland habitat. It's not a problem in the meadows. And reed canary grass, I don't know that we know where it came from. Reed canary grass is one of those plants that was introduced at some point because people thought it would be good forage. It does make high quantity of feed, but it doesn't make very high quality feed. So like, I'm not sure if it's something that got introduced back before the refuge like even had the Blitzen Valley as part of the refuge, or if it was one of those things that you know, came in on an animal from somewhere else. So I don't know that we actually know where it started. The spread, this really rapid invasion of reed canary grass, we think has been influenced by changing climate. So having less water available means that you're sometimes doing what they call water stacking. So that's essentially getting the water deep enough that it can fill some of the natural swales and channels to run back down a meadow. So essentially you're moving the water north and you're stacking it to get deep enough to reach some of these other channels so that it can then flow south into the meadows. And so some of that hydrologic disconnect and the way we have to manage water, especially in drier years, is creating pretty good conditions for growing reed canary grass. And so some of that expansion is associated with climate change. And then there is interest in at least reducing the amount of reed canary grass on the refuge, because reed canary grass is typically, especially in monoculture settings, so where you look at a field and it's just like 400 acres of reed canary grass, it is very dense stem-wise. It typically shades out all of the vegetation below it. So in places where reed canary grass has been growing for a long time, we often see these dense mats forming where nothing can really grow through them. It shades out forbs and the other plants that insects and birds need. It's not good nesting habitat for ground nesters. And so overall, it is not great quality habitat, but I think it's possible when there's water in it, it might be a good substitute for emergent vegetation. So like, I think the coots and soras are using it because they are marsh birds that want to nest in cattail and bulrush, and reed canary grass, when it is flooded, kind of mimics that structure. So it's possible some birds benefit from it, but not very many. And the amount of reed canary grass as it is expanding kind of rapidly is reducing the amount of habitat available, we think, to some of these other ground nesting species. Did I answer all of them?
Yes, you did.
Okay.
Okay. So Donna says the Ankeny, which is near where Donna is tried disking the marshes to abate the invasive vegetation to no avail. Mudflats have disappeared. Any promising practices out there, out where we are?
Up at Convoy, they've had great success at reducing the reed canary grass by disking it. But they disked it, I think they were disking it multiple times a year, and they disked it multiple years in a row. So it took them a while to see that benefit. Out here, we've talked a lot about the idea of trying to disk it. The issue is that you have to be able to get a machine out into those fields, and the way that our water moves out here in a wet year, especially, it would be almost impossible to get a machine out into those fields at the time of year you would want to disc it, because the soil would be too wet. And so we've had a lot of conversations about what the options are. Very potentially, they will include a combination of efforts like spring burning and disking and grazing, or, you know, some fun, maybe combination of all of the efforts that have been done elsewhere. And, you know, in a dry year, disking would definitely work better early in the spring than in a wet year like this year. It wouldn't have been possible to get equipment out to most of these sites early enough to do any sort of treatment. So right now, I think the answer is maybe there's some promising work being done, but because our water situation is so variable year to year, and because of the way the water comes off the steens and how if it's a big snow year and the water comes off fast, you can't really stop it from flooding fields. It creates a lot of management issues with copying some of the more effective reed canary grass management efforts.
Okay. I think that was a great answer, and almost probably a perfect place to leave it.
I'm going to make a plug for people who might be interested in volunteering to process audio data.
Yes, please do.
We'll be doing a training sometime this fall, potentially a one in Portland and a hybrid option, or one in Portland and one in Bend. We haven't decided yet, but I'll make sure to get information spread to people through Filmer and also through Bird Alliance of Oregon when we have a better understanding of when and where those are happening. But you can do the processing from home as long as you have a computer and access to the internet. So open to anybody.
Great, thanks for mentioning that. And I am going to mention the next 3 installments of our speaker series. So next month, we're going to hear from Emily, who is the summer technician that the Friends of Malheur have hired for the biological staff at the refuge to support the programs they have going on. She's going to tell us all about her summer experience at Malheur. And then in September, we're going to hear from Jess Wennick, the resource specialist currently on detail at the refuge. And in October, we're going to hear from Alexa Martinez, who is our wildlife biologist, and she's just batty for bats. And so she's really excited to talk to you about bats at the refuge, which is a really interesting topic that the Friends of Malheur are currently getting more involved in. And I will mention that if you didn't see the volunteer opportunity coming up to help survey some bats, please check out the last issue of your Malheur Musings newsletter. In the volunteer section, there's a plug there for some upcoming volunteer dates for bat surveys. With that, I just want to thank you all for being here for the July installment of the speaker series. And I really want to thank Bird for chatting with you all and telling you all about this really great work that they're doing. I'm hopeful that we'll have an article about it later on in this season with some updated information. So keep reading your newsletters, keep attending these programs. If you find value in these programs and you're enjoying them, or if you're watching them on the YouTube channel and want to support our effort to do this, we are asking for suggested donations of $10 a person. And you can make donations on our website at any time. So thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting the Friends, and thank you for supporting Malheur Refuge. Have a great evening.